Welcome to part 3, the people in the machine. So we've already talked about data algorithms, we've talked about robot wolves, we've talked about all kinds of things that seem like technology has leapt away from human control. It's become autonomous, it can do things not only that challenge the kind of worth of humans in society, but it can be used against humans to incarcerate them, deny them credit, and even have them killed. So one of the things I think it's always important to pull us back to is that so much of what seems like raw technology, systems, data, flashing screens have humans behind it, humans within it, socio-technical systems. And so not just the coding elite that's in the readings and that we talked about in the last part, but the kind of manual or low-end labor that powers a lot of artificial intelligence.
The ClickFarm example there is a great one. I mean, I think most of us imagine the algorithm, artificial intelligence, all kind of happening is just like this kind of confrontation between things that people have made and electricity just all happening, but like, yeah, the people in the machine thing here I think is really important to consider.
It's really fascinating. I don't know if anyone has ever seen the show Silicon Valley, which is kind of a parody of tech entrepreneurs, etc. in Silicon Valley. And there is one episode where they launch a new app. They're trying to get venture capital for it. It's not getting many downloads, and so they employ a ClickFarm to boost its downloads, and then they get this multi-million-dollar investment and this kind of thing, but they have this kind of ethical and moral dilemma about it. And it's a very realistic example, actually, of why these things matter, because there's a ClickFarm because the click has value. Yep. And if the click had not become a commodity, number of likes, number of follows, number of downloads boosts real generation of money, there wouldn't be ClickFarms, for example. So anyway, that's a really great starting point, because AI does depend upon human labor, the social and the socio-technical systems of AI and data markets. So in Burrell and Foucault's reading, they say AI's trajectory in society, however, is not simply a question of whether humanity will benefit or not, but rather who will benefit. And the who will benefit has obvious answers and less obvious answers, I think. So it's important to say, yeah, the coding elite are drivers of AI in our life. We want to focus on everyone else. And not just those who are impacted by it, but those caught in the machine, left outside of it, out of the loop, as it were. And they refer to in the article as the kind of cybertariat, which I think is a pretty interesting label. People often will talk of artificial intelligence as a fourth or a fifth industrial revolution, will completely change the world. But which world are they talking about? What patches of the world? And not just geographically, but which people, which classes, which realms of social life? We want to think that big data is all-encompassing, that algorithms are all-encompassing, that connectivity is all-encompassing, yet you still need to employ low-end wage labor to manipulate algorithms and all kinds of things. There are humans bound up in this machine in ways that we don't always expect.
Yeah. The thing that, like, I remember learning sociology when I was undergrad, was Manuel Castells' trilogy, The Information Age.
Yeah.
So it was like the late 90s. And there was this thing that I just didn't believe was real when I first heard it, was that, so this is 20 years ago, so it would have changed, but over half the world's population hadn't made a phone call by like 1998. They just simply hadn't. But we were now talking about this kind of new thing of this information age, with many of which were like left out of. So I think the kind of who of this and who benefits and all that kind of stuff in relation to those kind of things is important. We'll talk about that again in a lot more detail later in the course when we look at global inequality. Yeah,
exactly. And again, it's also fragmented and globalized in lots of ways too. So I think we need to think about how AI might unfold in parts of the world that are still reeling from earlier industrial revolutions. I mean, when people say it's a fourth or fifth industrial revolution, the world will never be the same. In many parts of the world, people are still contending with the first and second that have wreaked absolute havoc on their lives and livelihoods. And so much of the kind of work that is under threat from AI, much of the information work under threat from AI has already been outsourced to developing countries to begin with. And so it's actually there where a lot of the threat to jobs actually is, rather than in kind of the economies where everyone is so frightened about it. So at the heart of these kind of questions is to come to a better understanding of the relationship between AI and development, or AI and poverty, or AI and precarious labour. There's all kinds of different ways to think about it. And there's a really interesting BBC radio documentary by Ian Golden, who's an Oxford professor of globalisation and development, but he used to actually be head of policy at the World Bank Group. So he's really been in the kind of development bureaucracy. And the question of the podcast, and it's linked there, is whether AI will kill development. And his view is really fascinating, because he's like so many workers in developing countries are bound up in artificial intelligence and high technology, which just seems like the opposite of what we imagine. We imagine these really sophisticated worlds, these really sophisticated Silicon Valley and Japan and South Korea and German technology hubs and factories, etc., etc., etc. But so much of the low-end work happens in developing countries. And he actually begins in Kenya with a whole lot of workers who are tagging images that will be fed into data for driverless cars. And they're in this this kind of big sort of hangar in front of screens, and that's a traffic light, that's a curb, that's a stop sign, that's this, to power then the autonomous decision making of cars, which is a really great way to begin that juxtaposition. And he asks, is technology, especially automation and artificial intelligence, going to allow countries to steal a march on development and leap ahead, or is it going to be their undoing?
So he means there about, like, you know, what we currently, like, kind of symbolically violently call the first, second, and third is this going to allow the development happen so they can skip it and kind
jump
of
ahead, jump ahead, or come on, or is it will it break those structures? And I think it's a hard question to answer, but he's really interested in the relationships between AI and development and labour, and I think that they're really important questions when we think of the who. So one of the things that I'm interested in from sort of previous research is the risk of AI to India's IT sector, especially what we call sort of like the backroom IT that sustains many of the jobs in business process outsourcing, call centres, software development and data management. A common gripe in Western society, I called the helpline and I was transferred to India. There's a lot of times you transfer to India and also don't even know, because there's a lot of location masking that goes into training, etc., to sound like people are not in India, sound like they're near you, etc., etc., etc. But it's not just calls. A whole lot of the software support, IT support is outsourced, and also the backroom building of systems is outsourced. So while India has had a dramatic revolution in information technology, it's quite low-end and expendable jobs that really depend upon the outsourcing whims of Western corporations. There's not much mobility up, not much innovation, etc., etc., etc. It's concentrated in just a few cities, Bangalore, Hyderabad, to a lesser extent Kolkata, and just areas outside Delhi, Noida and Gurgaon, and draws hundreds of thousands of migrant workers from across the country. Local call centres have now opened in other areas of the country to stop a lot of the out-migration and stop the tide of people going to cities because they're losing young people. It's been a pretty empowering industry for women. Many who would have otherwise married if they'd stayed at home can then work and live in cities for 5-6 years, save some money, send it home, often get married later, etc. So it has been a really transformative industry. Bao Xiang, who's written a lot about this industry, looks at the whole network of labour agents, recruiters, tutors to train people for the tests to get into the call centre. You've got to take a test to get a job, fixers and travel agents entangled with the sector, for workers in India and for workers going to Australia, the US and the UK, and he calls these body shops. And it's a really interesting label because we imagine this to all be virtual work, but Bao's point is this is really labour intensive. So the quote down the bottom, quite the opposite of what is usually assumed, software development services are highly labour intensive, particularly at the phase of programming or testing and debugging. A lot of the work is really repetitive. A lot of it is not in ideal circumstances, long shifts, etc., etc., etc. So if the IT industry is a body shop, does AI replace all of that? Does AI effectively mean the end of the body shop? So AI will heavily impact this sector, which remains poorly organised, barely unionised, and highly casualised. There's not many rights. It's been a very difficult industry to unionise, etc., etc., etc. Those that have been unionised tend to be shut down pretty quickly. So it's a pretty dramatic area of kind of labour relations. Particularly in India, that has had pockets of strong labour relations in the past. But what's really interesting about AI is it can just do so many of those processes that you used to do a human for low-end labour. It can match patterns, it can answer queries. When the chatbot pops up on the lot of your screen, that'll be AI, and if you get 10 or 12 prompts down, then a person will jump in. But by doing those 12 prompts, they've eliminated 400 people from the process. So that's probably where some of the first big kind of casualties from AI happen. The Indian government's responded with this AI for All strategy, which is a fascinating document. With a colleague, we've written an article about it, but about this kind of populist view of AI, that India will take some of this technology, turn it into technology that benefits the most people, etc., etc., etc. And they do talk about what might happen to to IT workers, because the idea is that while these low-end jobs will go, new higher-end jobs will be put in their place. A common thing we hear about industrial transformations, you know, the steel factory might close, but there'll be other jobs in renewable industries for you, etc., etc., etc. But the report notes quite contradictorily that despite over 2 million STEM graduates in 2016 alone, that's how many people graduate with STEM degrees within India, not counting Indians overseas. An overwhelming majority of this pool is focused on routine IT and development and not so much on research and innovation. So the shorthand there is they may not have anywhere to go. There may not be any jobs for the majority of that workforce. So where these workers will go when the body shops gear down or close entirely is a compelling question for local governments, where local labour markets are both unattractive, especially for people with degrees, and incapable of absorbing even a small proportion of that workforce. So they're all leaving cities and going home to smaller cities and towns. What will they do, etc.? But it's worth pointing out it's not just IT and call centre workers who will be affected, but the ancillary livelihoods entangled in that too, entangled in the analogue presence. The people who rent rooms to them, the neighbourhood restaurants and shops that serve all these workers, the transport workers, etc., etc., etc. Now imagine that replicated in lots of different parts of the world, and it's the actual low end of this is where a lot of the vulnerability is, which would also be necessary in those early stages of establishment. So, should we be afraid? Okay, AI agents are very good at eliciting patterns, but deficient in making socially aware decisions. I think we can agree on that. Yeah. Furthermore, biases in the algorithms and data that underpin AI may lead to algorithmic discrimination against marginalized groups. I think we can agree on that. Additionally, at times, even a developer cannot predict the emergent behaviors of complex AI agents. That is, they cannot predict what the machines will do. And that is quite concerning and frightening when the autonomy gets so autonomous that it's beyond reeling back in.
Yeah, there's the fears. Is it Roscoe's basilic? The kind of the idea that and people are generally scared about this in the Silicon Valley world is that if AIs become self-aware, will it then kill off the people that were critical of it in the past? And there's this kind of debates about how whether that will happen or not, to the point where people are trying to sometimes delete things that they've said online about.
Scroll through an old message board and come back and kill. And some of these things seem so unfeasible, but then notice that so many of the things we live in now seem unfeasible if we'd raised them, a decade ago. So our response generally, our response as people, has been to call for core agencies such as health, policing and education to no longer use black box AI systems, to be more transparent, to continue with human decision making and moral decision making, etc. And there's also been calls for explainable AI, both explaining the models used and the interpretations that can be made from using AI. Even some of the cryptocurrencies, some of the blockchain technology, that is an attempt to have explainable tech. It's not exactly AI, but AI can be used to manipulate it and kind of capitalize on it. So all the detailed computational work of AI would be passed into a language about what it's doing and what it would do, and this would be something we learn in school like we learn other things about civics and other behaviour. But this doesn't tell us whether it's a good idea to use AI in the first place, only about how the AI agent worked and the processes that went in it. So maybe we need a new form of public pedagogy around AI, which takes away the idea that AI is some sort of magic and asks really basic questions: if, when, and where AI should be used and why. And if we can't answer the why, then we shouldn't do it.
Yeah, it's the inevitability of it that frustrates me, that it's just like a thing that's happening, get on board or not.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. This is teleological. And that's why I think Golden's interesting in bringing back ideas. This sounds a little bit like what people said about development. Inevitably incomes will rise, inevitably people will consume more, inevitably they get healthier and societies would get more equal, and of course that hasn't happened. And so some of the same language can be used in artificial intelligence and data. So should we be afraid? Yes.